Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Father Tony Green. I'm Director of Pastoral Care and Volunteer Services and one of the leaders with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. We've got the honor and privilege today to welcome Rabbi Matt Cutler from Congregation Gates of Heaven. I'm going to do a little intro, give a thumbnail bio of Rabbi Matt, and he can expound on that if he'd like. And then he's going to speak with us on the importance of Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is actually on Friday, but Rabbi Matt is available to us today, so he's speaking with us today. So Rabbi Matt joined Congregation Gates of Heaven as its spiritual leader in July of 1995. He was ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City in 1990, where he also obtained his Master of Arts and Hebrew Letters. He graduated with honors from the State University of New York at Binghamton, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts in History and Judaic Studies. And he and I are both a part of Clergy Against Hate, Schenectady Clergy Against Hate, and he does all kinds of great things for our community. So welcome, Rabbi Matt. We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tony, and I am honored to be here. And, when the invitation comes, to be a part of this, it was very important for me to say yes. One, because of the strong leadership that Ellis Hospital plays in our community. Two, for the incredible individual friendship and leadership that people like Paul Milton and Tony Green play in my life and in my community. These are important things. This is an interesting place, and as I was thinking about my presentation to you this day, one of the things I wanted to start with was why January 27th? What is it about International Holocaust Remembrance Day that puts that date on the calendar? Because it is a different date than the State of Israel and the Jewish calendar to commemorate the Holocaust. January 27th was the day that the Russian army liberated Auschwitz, and the world saw firsthand the pictures and the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis during their 12-year reign of terror from 1933 to 1945. Jewish sources, the State of Israel, decided to focus on a date in April when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place as a way of marking Jewish resistance to genocide, anti-Semitism, and the Nazi machinery. It wasn't an outstanding uprising that pushed back the Nazis forever, not hardly. But it signified a chance for the Jewish residents of Warsaw to say that they weren't going to go peacefully into the night to extermination. Why is this date important? Because we live in a society right now in which racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and discrimination has gained footing once again as a polarizing element that creates a power vacuum that is going to be filled. There's no place for hatred in our community. And as we remember the incidents of the Holocaust, we expand this model to talk about other forms of discrimination and bigotry and hatred. I'm sad to say that since the war ended in 1945, and we're approaching 78 years, anti-Semitism, with its ebbs and flows, it's still a part of the world culture. And this has to be stopped by being aware of our past so we do not repeat it. So let's hit pause on that element of the introduction about why this is important. And it's not important only as a Jew. It's important for me as a community leader, as an American, as a person of conscience, and as a human being. This is the paradigm of when evil runs amok, we have to address this. Now, let's take a look at the Holocaust itself from a quick history lesson and something that has to be said about looking beyond the dates. Number one, the reign of the Nazis was from 1933 until 1945. The Holocaust did not start right then and there. There was legislation that passed in the 1930s, 1938, that discriminated against Jews, preventing them from being in certain offices and being in school with other children who weren't Jewish. Real segregation type atmosphere. It escalated to periods of outward nastiness and hostility and violence against Jews. Most importantly, as when we look at this date called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass that happened in November in 1937, in which a young man walked into Paris to the German embassy and shot a Nazi official because of the growing anti-Semitism. The response was an organized rioting that trashed Jewish homes. The United States was aware of it. It made front page news around the world. And there was a question within this country of dealing with a proper response. We'll get to that one in a couple of minutes. It wasn't, then you had a period of forced deportations and putting people into concentration camps that escalated in 1941 after a conference in southern Germany into a period of downright genocide. During that period of time, from 1933 to 1945, 6 million Jews approximately were murdered by the Nazis. Some in the crematorium, some exterminated by gas in the concentration camps, some shot in open pits in Babi Yar, places like Babi Yar, some were just executed for the sake of it. It was an atrocity, but Jews weren't the only ones who were singled out. Gypsies were singled out. Political descendants were singled out. Homosexuals were singled out. Those who were mentally challenged were singled out. Those that were disabled were singled out. There was no place for them in Nazi Germany. And as the German Empire expanded during that period of World War II, so did the atrocities to deal with the Jewish question. Now, we can go on and on and on about what happened during that 12-year reign of terror. And we have to study that a little bit, especially about leaders who advocated for hatred and bigotry and anti-Semitism, intimidation that happened for people to remain silent. One of the most famous poems that emerged at this time was from a Protestant minister that started off that said, when they came for the Jews, I didn't speak out because I wasn't Jewish. And when they came for the labor unionists, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a labor unionist. And went on and on and on. And the last line of the poem is, and when they came for me, there was nobody to speak out. Being able to have the confidence, confidence and know the responsibility of to speak out against hatred is a very important thing. And it begins with learning history and realizing that if we don't learn from our past, we are destined to repeat it. So what happened? One, what happened in Nazi Germany didn't appear overnight. It was a part of Europe for centuries. In fact, it was Napoleon who was the first one who gave the Jew citizenship in Europe. That's right, in the 1800s. When I tell you that my grandfather who grew up in Europe and my grandmother who grew up in Poland and other relatives, they were not Russians, not Ukrainians, not Austrians, not Germans, not Polish. They were always labeled as Jews. And as a result, they were second tier. The Napoleonic Code changed that for a brief period of time on a legislative level, but there was still blatant and rampant anti-Semitism that was rooted in blood libel, that Jews killed Christian children to make matzah, deicide accusations, which until 1964 was the official doctrine that many people held on to, especially within the Catholic Church. It took Vatican II in 1964 to say, stop it. Don't blame the Jews of today of what happened 2,000 years ago. Deicide means the killing of a deity, of God, Jesus. It went through economic situations where Jews were forbidden from owning land and were put into positions of mercantile and banking, and usury was seen as a sin, a transgression. Read Shakespeare, look at the Merchant of Venice and the image of Shylock. These things were present. What really changed in the late 19th century was Darwinism and the theory of evolution. What started to take place was, as you were dealing with theory of evolution, there were anti-Semites who said the Jew was less than human, that they were less than the evolutionary chain permitted. In fact, during the Nazi regime, this is when their science kicked in, measuring Jewish heads and noses and looking at the biology of what it is as a Jewish race that made them less than equal to the Aryan nation, to the Aryan population of Germany. Quick side, the Jews weren't the only one. African Americans and Blacks in particular were really a part of it. Look at the controversy of Jesse Owens in 1936 running the Olympics and how the Nazi Party refused to greet him or acknowledge his wins, and not even being present in the stadium when he won his gold medals. But that's an aside. Where this started to escalate, yet again, was as a result of the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. Germany was held financially culpable. War reparations, the demilitarization and the humiliation of the German society was apparently very painful. And they looked for a scapegoat, someone to blame. In this time, a former corporal and an unemployed artist from Vienna by the name of Adolf Hitler gained in popularity. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf about dealing with the struggle against the Jewish presence, as it was a crippling part and bore the responsibility for the German heartache. Political compromise after political compromise, and after a Reichstag fire in the early 1930s led to Hitler becoming chancellor and growing in this point. And then it all escalated from then. And fear and intimidation was an important tool in controlling the masses. You know, there are 2 or 3 different schools of thought about what happened and why it happened. On one hand, you have William Goldhagen from Harvard University, who wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioner. and said that every German has to bear responsibility, because if you helped in the German machinery from running the trains or supplying the army, you bear responsibility for what occurred. And then on the other side, you have Eric Larson, who in a fabulous book called In the Garden of the Beasts, takes a look about the intimidation of the SA, the brown shirts, and the fear of the Gestapo and the SS really put on the average German to either comply or at best be silent. You do have heroic measures, people who hid Jews during this time. And they are remembered in Israel at a place called Yad Vashem, the hand in the name, which is a quote from Isaiah, really talking about memory. And the Holocaust Museum there at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has a place of the path of the righteous Gentiles, a forest of people that with names on every tree that says, these are the people that stood up to the Nazis and hid Jews in this regard under fear of what went on. Now, history has to be learned. And one of the valuable lessons that I think is essential for us to understand is, number one, the Nazis did not operate in a vacuum. They operated in a culture in which all these things were prevalent. Two, genocide didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of discrimination, misinformation, of advocating through propaganda and legislating the Jew to be removed from society. And then it escalated into the death of Jews and then mass extermination. The concentration camp is only the tip of the iceberg. Three, understanding the history and the dormant feelings of racism and disempowerment and frustration was the perfect formula to grow in hatred. Four, history says we have to speak out. Now, subsection number 2B, dealing with history, is to deal with how the world responded to this. There's a lot of really interesting things out now that really comes into looking at the American response in particular. In the fall, Ken Burns did this incredible documentary, 3-part documentary about the US and the Holocaust. And one of the things that he pointed out was America's silence was rooted in different elements. One, remember, this was less than 100 years after the end of the Civil War. And there were people who grew up in a reconstructive world in which bigotry and Jim Crow laws were still very much apparent. So the initial things by the Nazis were met with shrugs by parts of the American society. Well, we're doing the same here. What difference does it make what happens there? Two, a feeling of isolation. As a result of World War I, there were a lot of people who said, we don't want to get involved in a conflict overseas or an internal country's policy and practice. Three, there was a real push to find support for what Nazis were trying to mobilize in this country. If you look at Rachel Maddow's podcast, Ultra, she kind of draws to the fact that there was a political void in this country that wanted a strong leader to help us come out of an economic depression and really try to lead us. Some saw the answer in a very supportive way with the way that Nazis ran. And then there was this concept of blatant and American anti-Semitism that really was also a factor in our lack of response. How did that play out? Well, first of all, we had a growing xenophobia. In the early 1920s, we had the Homestead Act that limited immigration. Jews were not, European Jewry were limited in their ability to come in here. Those countries that the United States were willing to take more of were those with better qualities of education, economic support. If this sounds familiar from not too long ago, it's meant to be, to bring them in. English-speaking individuals, all right? People from England, people from Ireland, people from Scandinavia. But the growing sense of the poor, desolate Jew was not necessarily its own class. And the Jew was lumped in with their nationality, the German, the Poles, the Russian, and they fit into those quotas. There was outcry in America. Stephen Wise, an American rabbi who was also leading it, really mobilized the people of the Jewish community to bring this to attention. Roosevelt had an ear, but also was fighting for his own political well-being, as well as dealing with internal American economic crises. So it didn't always make the top of his agenda. We also had a growing sense of apathy. We had quota systems in this country. We had discrimination in this country. We had these things that were met with not necessarily an incredible response to the growing things of Nazi Germany. It wasn't until it escalated, when the war became apparent, that things realized how tough they were. There were rumors, there were stories, there were accusations. In fact, during World War II, there was a concerted effort by guys like Rabbi Stephen Wise to plead with the Roosevelt administration to bomb the railway stations and the tracks that led to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and all these death camps. And the response was no, because it would take away the effort from the bigger part of ending the war, to direct the efforts to winning the war at all quickly, rather than to change some of our assets to bomb different parts of Germany to prevent the transportation of millions of Jews to the death camps. America is one example. Vichy France was another example. You saw it elsewhere. Actually, when Jews went to migrate in any way, there was a major influx into China, pre-communist China, which had Jews present. Remember Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration? Well, he's one of those Jews. He was born in Germany, raised in Shanghai, and then emigrated to the United States after the war. There, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, was one of these Jews who kind of was born in Europe and kind of lived and escaped with her family, hid her Jewish identity until later in life. These are things that went on of real persecution and atrocity. So history, it needs important to know. What have we learned in the last nearly 80 years. One, genocide still happens. Let me repeat that again. Genocide still happens. Not just to Jews, but to other people. You can look in Burma. You can look in China. You can look in Rwanda. You can look at other places, and you can see, and you can look in Cambodia. Genocide happened and still does. Therefore, it's imperative that we as Jews, we as Americans, we as people of conscience and faith need to speak out. There was a very interesting moment in the Reagan administration when Reagan was going to Bitburg, Germany, to work with the German, in the middle of the Cold War, really to deal with West Germany and to acknowledge the solidarity between the United States and Germany as we all dealt with what he called the evil empire. And he was going to go to a cemetery in Germany and place a wreath that also was the cemetery for a lot of SS soldiers who were part of the killing machine of Jews. Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize winner, stood in the Oval Office of the White House and said to Reagan, "That is not your place. Your place is with the victims, not the perpetrators." That type of message needs to be heard loud and clear. In terms of American policy, how has it played out? We've taken in very much a different approach on immigration. We are struggling to how to deal with an outward policy of immigration, especially as we deal with people coming in across the southern border. One of the important organizations that help people come into this country is called HIAS, H-I-A-S, which is the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. It's how my grandparents came to America, to be honest with you, under their support and auspices. And they had an interesting thing where Jewish immigration has really trickled down to next to nothing, but really they didn't want to get rid of the H in HIAS because they wanted to focus in on its roots of its doctrine of remembering that we were strangers in a foreign land, as the Bible teaches us 36 times, to really focus in on that notion of emigration and there about what has happened in the past and what we have to do to help better immigrants succeed in America. We have to learn and we have to move forward. The other thing we have to be very careful is that we don't always hear the silent whistles of people who speak as a mobilizing call for bigotry, hatred, anti-Semitism, discrimination, and racism. Let me say that in a very clear way. Please don't tell me I'm wrong when I see something as anti-Semitic, or a person of color feel that they were being discriminated. It's a feeling. It is a gut response to a situation. Yes, maybe it's being manipulated for political reasons. I get that, that's a possibility. But do not assume that's the case from the get-go. One of the things I learned from an organization like Black Lives Matter is I don't know what it's like to be an American and be a person of color in this country. I was always taught to love and respect and depend on the police. But that's my culture and my cultural experience. Others have had theirs. So learn to listen and empathize. 2, there's a difference between memory and history. History is very much a social science where there's fact and information. Memory is personal. Memory sometimes gets facts distorted because it responds to the situation. That's an important understanding as well. And when you talk to people from a historical perspective, and they're talking on a memory perspective. We're on two different plateaus. And as a result, we're going to not hear each other correctly. The chances are we have to learn how to listen in this regard so that we can be able to show respect and understanding for the other and agree to disagree, but understand the sentiments behind things. There's a vulnerability that we have as Americans. There's a vulnerability that I have as a Jew. Anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination and bigotry are very prevalent. In fact, it's growing. Anti-Semitism is up in 2022, 27% in New York State alone. There are incidents of violence against Jews, swastikas being drawn on buildings in that regard. And sometimes they serve, and comments from political officials that serve as a dog whistle that will mobilize a population that they don't even realize. So what do? We have to build bridges. We have to listen to each other. We have to agree to disagree and not be afraid to speak out when we feel that there's injustice going on. International Holocaust Memorial Day on January 27th is a very, very important day because it's not my holiday alone. It's the world's holiday that was established by the UN to say, we remember. We remember what fear yielded to power, when hatred dominated reason, violence took place over peaceful discourse, when hatred, bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism ran amok as policy that caused hardship, destruction, and death to millions and millions of people whose legacy belongs to us. So here's where I'm going to pause and yield back to Tony, to Reverend Green, to let him facilitate a Q&A.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Matt. You're such a fantastic educator, but as you differentiate between history and memory, remembering, and that connection to what Holocaust Remembrance Day on Friday is. And you evoked some things for me. You gave me some new information that I wasn't aware of, but just a couple of things. One of the most striking books I read during my seminary days was Night by Elie Wiesel. And I can appreciate you referencing him. And one of the stories in that book, and you can correct me if I don't get it quite right, but he's confronted by someone whose faith is being challenged as they're being forced to watch the hanging of a young Jewish boy. And the person says, where is your God now? Because their faith has been so challenged, they have no concept of God. And Elie says, well, our God is being hanged right in front of us. And that I went to seminary 25 plus years ago, and that's just, certain things just strike you so deeply. And I can hear the passion in your voice too. And then secondly, when you talked about the Gentiles, the people who are marked on trees, their names of having helped to do what they can to liberate the Jews. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer happens to be one of my most favorite. He's a Lutheran pastor who was murdered for his attempt or working toward overthrowing the Nazis, but left major writings that still speak to us today. So those are a couple of things that I'm taking, and still lots more that you said that I'll ponder. And I just want to now open it up to anybody else. Anybody else have questions?
Wait a second, you can't throw those three big topics at me and not let me respond. Hang on one second.
All right, Go for
First
it.
of all, I got to tell you, one of the most incredible moments of when I was ordained from seminary was when Rabbi Arnie Sluterberg, who walked across the Bema at Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan and got ordained. Rabbi Sluterberg is a first generation American. His parents were born in Europe. And present with his family was a Dutch family that hid the grandparents and the young Slotenberg father in their basement. So this is an incredible thing. It's like here, Hitler didn't win. You know, last year, a guy named Edward Shamus died. He was the last of the Easy Company, of the band of brothers, to pass away. And when he came back from America, he brought back with him cognac from Hitler's wine cellar in the Eagle's Nest in Austria. And every time, and I have to quote him verbatim, every time there was a wedding, a birth, a bar mitzvah in his family, he cracked open a bottle of that cognac and literally stood up. And here's the quote. And so forgive me for being rude, but he stood up and said, "Fuck you, Hitler." That was his toast. The question about where is God? Oh, there's dropping the F-bomb and then going right to God. Let's find a sacred pause here for a second. Dealing with that theological question, where is God, you have to understand something about Elie Wiesel. He grew up in a more traditional Hasidic community where God was present in the good, the bad, and the ugly. The God was there. You will see it in teachings of guys like Martin Buber, where it says that, you know, God was present. It was humanity that turned their face away from relationship with God. It was our responsibility that God was there, but the fault was us. Yes. And the third point you raised, night was important. Where is God? Elie Wiesel tells a powerful story. The Diary of Anne Frank tells a powerful story. There are many of these memoirs that are out there that tell powerful stories. In fact, when teaching the Holocaust, especially on a high school level, those are the books that you start with. There was a controversy about one of them not too long ago about an illustrated graphic novel called Maus, M-A-U-S, because the vulgarity and cartoon nudity was going to be banned by school districts down in southeast Tennessee, because of the fact that it used, ugly words and, cartoon. The image was that Nazis were cats and the Jews were mice. That was the premise of the book. It's a powerful trilogy of books there that I found as a teaching tool for children, for high school kids, have been very important. So we have this challenge of how do we teach our children about the ugliness, the vulgarity of bigotry, but at the same time, be respectful. So that's like when I kind of used that F word, I did so deliberately because I needed you to hear the vulgarity, because the genocide is vulgar. All right. Next question.
Thank you.
This is Chrissy. I have a question. So you had mentioned kind of towards the end about like building the bridge and what you can do. And, when my ask is, when you encounter someone who says to you or brings forward a situation where they feel that an action was discriminatory against them, and you have that rift of maybe the people that were involved and then their experience, what might be some guiding language to kind of bridge everyone together? And I use this in the context of sometimes patient care. A patient may come forward and say, I felt this. The staff may feel another way. How do you bridge those two together?
Part of it is to find out where the images of powerlessness come into play. In the patient care issue is that image of it's not an equal partnership. The call button you know, I feel discriminated because you're not responding to the call button. I'm not feeling, you know, heard in this regard. You're taking too long. You're not respecting me as because of my color. That there's a sense of lack of power and that vulnerability. So I would suggest that that's the first place that you start in the conversation. What is the situation? What is the power dynamics coming in here? And how does that play out in the care? The second element, and this is hard, is in the institution of a hospital, the caregiver is part of the institution. Look, you know, Paul knows, and thank you, by the way, to the staff of Ellis Hospital. I have a pacemaker that I came in through the emergency room and I got. But what I realized as a patient was my vulnerability. What I realized was my concerns for me was heard, but when I was one of several patients that they were being treated. And I didn't always know why or how I was being triaged, or why and how I was being treated, or not. You know, my situation was not critical, and therefore some other patient. And how much can you share in that regard? What I ask of a patient, to answer your question, is don't get defensive. And don't try to justify. On the opposite, try to validate the sense of lack of empowerment and be able to hear them and be able to say, me, so-and-so, individuals, not institutional, are there to help and advocate for you. One of the things that I love about the hospital is when I go visit, I love that dry erase board above by a patient's bed that says your nurse is so-and-so, your assistant is going to be so-and-so, your doctor on call is so-and-so, because you give names to people and all of a sudden you matter. So please don't forget your patients' names. Use it. And if, you know, sometimes like, look, Tony put me down as Matthew Cutler, and I quickly changed it to Matt. All right, hear them and adjust the vocabulary accordingly. Did I answer your question?
You did. I actually wrote down actionable items, so thank you.
Okay,
No,
good.
good. Thanks.
Bill, I see your lips moving. You took the mic off, but some reason I can't hear you.
It's muffled. You may have to type it into the chat because we're not hearing you.
Up your volume, maybe? Top left-hand corner of your, oh, okay. As Bill tries to type in his answer, because we're having trouble hearing him, is there another question in the meantime?
Yeah, it's Paul. Just a quick question. Somewhat related to what Chrissy said, maybe. If it goes to your point about there's hatred out there, and don't be afraid. What did I write down? Don't be afraid to speak out. And you gave that story about I didn't speak out, and then if I'm kind of at the end, someone needs to speak for me. If I'm in a small group of, if I'm in a break room, some employees, and someone says something, and in this case it could be anti-Semitic or something, it's out of bounds, kind of. What's your advice to give to a person to speak out and say something, to get the courage to say something?
The simple words are, that comment makes me a little uncomfortable. All right. And it can be about anything. It could be about color. It could be about religion, about sexual orientation. I will throw in political party now. Okay. In the polarized American society, that's important to say. That comment makes me a little uncomfortable. And then step 2 is to pull them aside privately and express why. One, in a group of people, it's important to be able to say that you don't approve, that because silence sometimes gives compliance. And that is important to say. So you have to say something, but you don't also want to embarrass or get into confrontational situations, but rather to diffuse it. So by announcing it, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that. It's important to say so. And then pulling them aside, kind of explain your rationale and let them be able to explain their rationale. To hear, and the dialogue is very, very important.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. All right, Bill, how are we doing with you? Can we figure you out yet?
No, still can't hear you.
I could have him run down to my office.
Maybe.
Anybody else? About somebody else? Anybody else got a question for Rabbi Matt?
I have a question. Is there a special service this Friday for Shabbos, in turn being with the Holocaust Remembrance Day?
The answer is for no. Okay. There will be a mention of it in our congregation on the Bima. There will be a part of our worship in which it's remembered. This is a fairly new addition to the calendar. The Jewish calendar kind of makes Yom HaShoah in April, Holocaust Memorial Day in April. But because the civil calendar and because the UN has done it, we are adapting to it. So as of now, we don't have a special service. What we're doing is a special prayer and reading as part of our Sabbath Eve service on Friday night to commemorate and to remember what we do and who we are. The theme there is not going to be, all right, I'm going to go on a tangent based on your question. So forgive me. One of the things that I will tell you we do is there's a fine line about when do we commemorate and go through a period of mourning, or how much do we use this as a tool to empower people to go forward. You know, when we do Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah in April, the question was, well, do we do this for the survivors and their families? Or do we do it for the next generation about anti-Semitism and racism and bigotry? And that is the dance. So for me, it's for both, but it's a 70-30 split. Truth is, the survivors are quickly diminishing. Last year, no, during COVID, we mourned the passing of the last member of our congregation who was tattooed in Auschwitz with the number that came from the camps. We have nobody left in our congregation who survived the camps. It's been 78 years. They're gone. But the memory still lingers. So we remember the atrocity, but we use it as a teaching tool to go forward. And that's the important thing about the Holocaust Memorial Day, is to be able to remember, so we use it to go forward.
You know, Matt, I've been over to Israel a couple of times. I've been to the Holocaust Museum twice. And what you just said is my experience of going through that museum, where I feel the heaviness and the just pain of what's on display, but yet my prophetic advocacy side just wants to do something to make sure, what can I, as you said, genocide still happens throughout the world. So what can I do now? You know, it's kind of that mixed thing.
All right, so I'm going to tell you, one, create the ritual for yourself personally. When you go to the supermarket, in the international food section, there'll be a Jewish family, and there'll be a candle that burns for 24 hours. It's called the yard site or memorial candle. Light one. And remember, I'm doing this for the millions that died. And do it with a personal prayer of, I personally am going to take it upon myself not to do this. So We have to create the rituals for ourselves to remember it. You know, the same way, and I don't want to be trite, but like on Valentine's Day, you know, we send a card to our loved ones. You know, so create a personal ritual for yourself. All right. Now, Bill sent a message. All right. And here it is. I'm going to read it and see where we stand. You touched on powerlessness, which often makes people receptive to strong leaders. To enact positive change and build bridges, we have to reach out to those who feel the lack of power. What are we doing or need to do in our area? That's a very, very important question. And this is something that actually, you know, Tony and I can speak about from the Schenectady Clergy Against Hate. During that summer in which the George Floyd protests were coming through our cities, it was important that our role was to bear witness about those people's stories. And as we deal with situations of powerlessness, we have to validate the voices of those who feel disenfranchised. As a white guy, I am part of the institutional societal problem, all right? I have to acknowledge my white privilege. I have to acknowledge my male privilege. I have to know that when I speak, I don't know what it's like to be in a room with a bunch of men and be the one person who's not identifying as male. I have to be understanding of what it means to be in a room of all white people and to be the one person of color in a smaller setting. That notion of empathy, that notion of being able to identify is important, but be careful. Do not patronize and do not be condescending and do not be overly empathetic in this regard. To acknowledge it to self, to take actions to make sure that other people who feel disenfranchised in a room may feel empowered to be, which may mean inviting them to speak, and may be being able to say to others, please don't talk over them. It may be in a regard. Now, there are certain things that I want to point out. There's one that happens on the one-on-one relationship in small group, and then there's others that become practices and policies. And that's important to understand, because as we try to legislate this, we also have to make sure we're educating at the same time and building bridges through experiences. What makes a community thrive is when we break down the neighborhood barriers based on socioeconomic, gender, color, and we start listening to each other. When we sit down and have a cup of coffee or beer, as President Obama used to do, with someone who's different than us, and to listen and not talk over. Did I answer that, Bill? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay. Last comment, because I know time is short. Is there anyone else who want to add?
Rabbi Matt, this is Carolyn Lansing, and I feel honored to have you speak today. And I think just listening to you has made me feel like a better person.
Thank you.
I thank you so much, truly.
I appreciate that. Thank you very, very much. And I applaud the efforts of so many.
Hi, Rabbi Matt. This is Jackie Montgomery. No question, I know we're running low on time, but I also just wanted to say thank you so much for really speaking from the heart, but in a very realistic way that's so applicable to the world that we're in today. And I hope that more people can hear these messages and help us to not repeat history and to step away from the trends that you were speaking of and create a more inclusive and a more welcoming world and a more welcoming community. So thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi Matt, Rabbi Matt, clearly I need more coffee. Again, I know we're short of time, but this was such a pleasure to be part of this conversation, really insightful. And everything that you had mentioned, all the points about the Holocaust and how genocide still happen around the world, so true. And we're, in this world, there's so much going on, and each one of us sometimes feels like we don't have a voice. But every day in our daily interactions, having these conversations, keeping this in mind, it all has this trickle effect and domino effect. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Just something from experience is understanding and knowing that sometimes this collective trauma and how, the impact that people who are oppressed, what it carries. Something we need to be aware of is how that sometimes the oppressed can sometimes become the oppressor. And we need to kind of remind ourselves and look around in the world and say, there's certain parts of the world where people are quiet, and how each one of us, if we can speak up and mention those people and stand up, can make a difference. So I appreciate you sharing that. And it is a big reminder. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. And that's important. That notion of collective trauma, that's a phrase that we need to, we have to understand and be able to do, to hold on to, because as when someone asked earlier about, when they feel victimized, that we can't always put a rational words to this because it's experiential in that regard. So thank you for that. That's a very important statement.
So if we could, we'd all give you a round of applause, Rabbi Matt, and you've given us lots to think about. Appreciate you coming. Love to have you come back again.
I would be honored. I would be honored. And
But
Paul, was that Mike O'Hara who in your office?
Yes, yeah, he came. He says hello.
Please send him my regards back.
I will.
Thank you so very much, Tony and Paul and the rest of the people on. Thank you for the honor to be able to teach with you and to share with you. And I'd be honored always to come back and support you guys and to be a part of the hospital system in any way, shape, or form. So thank you very much. And I wish you all well. Take care.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.